when I felt invisible, this guy actually saw me. He accepted me for who I am. He respected me. He loved me, and I loved him. And we were childhood friends. On October 7th, this amazing man named Omri, he got murdered at the Nova Festival, and two of our other friends, Sur and Aviad, they had a choice, basically. They were with Omri, and when they saw him get the bullets and starting bleeding to death, they tried to understand whether they should run for their lives or stay with Omri. They decided to take him on the cost of their speed, and trying to run away with his body. I mean, just think about it for a second, Ian. You literally have a body. It doesn't make any sense to rescue a body when your life is in danger, but they did it anyway.
Hi everyone, welcome back to Off Limits. Today I have a really great conversation with my good friend Stav Cohen. He's a reservist in the IDF in Israel, and we talk about everything. We talk about October 7th, what's happened after October 7th, what he thinks should happen in the aftermath, and about anti-Semitism, all kinds of stuff. It's a great conversation. We have a couple of questions at the end that are actually exclusive for Substack members. So if you're interested in hearing the full conversation, head over to my Substack. There's a link below, and you can subscribe. It's $5 a month, $50 a year. You can help support the independent work I'm doing. Really appreciate all your help and support. But go support Stav as well. What he's doing is just amazing. So hope you enjoy the conversation. Stav Cohen, my friend, how are you? Thanks so much for joining me.
I'm very well, sir. Thank you for having me.
So we haven't spoken in person for a little while, but we actually met in Nashville. You were touring the South, basically telling everyone about your experience in the IDF, your experience post-October 7th. So before we dig into some of the other stuff we're going to talk about, I would love it if you just give everyone who's listening just a sense of your experience and what you've been working on the last couple of months.
Right. So basically, it all started back in 2014 when I was 18-year-old, and in the same year, my mother put a sandwich in my hands and sent me to school. Basically, they put a gun in my hands and sent me to fight in Gaza. So it all started there. When I was 18, I faced difficult situations in which you can literally see terrorists, armed terrorists, dressed up as civilians, using kids as human shields. I'll break it down in one sentence. In the middle of a battlefield, you can actually see that they're sending 10, 8-year-old kids riding bicycles, so you'll have to cease fire. And then they could maybe relocate, and change their positions and stuff. Ever since then, I realized that something is rotten here, and that the world has to know that this isn't a fair fight. Back in 2014, I got injured in Gaza and had my surgery, got back into fight. And nowadays, when I'm not in reserves, I'm trying to, as you've mentioned, go around the world and tell people the truth, which is sometimes complicated, sometimes lies in gray areas,
So let's talk about really October 7th, which is, I think, where the reason we met, right? Unfortunately, it's horrible. Like the worst things in the world can actually bring people together. And so what was your experience, firstly, on October 7th? Like, what did that mean for you? How did it impact you? What do you want people to understand about that day? Because especially a lot of people in the world who aren't Jewish, October 7th in many ways was just another day. There's a lot of people who care deeply about it, but there's also a lot of people who, so far away, doesn't matter. So what does that day mean to you?
October 7th was the day that my life has changed completely. At 6:30 a.m. Saturday morning, I was sleeping with my girlfriend as soon as the sirens started going. And we woke up, realized that you have a massive rocket attack on Israel. And then I could see on Telegram that you have terrorists, dozens, hundreds of them going into Israel and starting a massacre. So I have a personal gun. I took it. started driving south, and then I got the text and the call to report, like the call up order, to
Hmm.
go to my unit and not just go wherever I want. So I did it. We got the gear, got everything organized, and we went to the battlefield and started fighting. Um, I'll tell you what. Let me take you back for 10 seconds to 2013, when I was 18-year-old. Even when I was 16-year-old, I was the shortest kid in class, the skinniest. I had the highest voice and literally zero self confidence, and I barely had friends. I mean, I had one dear friend. His name was Omri, and Omri, when I felt invisible, this guy actually saw me. He accepted me for who I am. He respected me. He loved me. And I loved him. And we were childhood friends. On October 7th, this amazing man named Omri, he got murdered at the Nova Festival. And two of our other friends, Sur and Aviad, they had a choice, basically. They were with Omri, and when they saw him get the bullets and starting bleeding to death, they tried to understand whether they should run for their lives or like stay with Omri. They decided to take him on the cost of their speed, and trying to run away with his body. I mean, just think about it for a second, Ian. You literally have a body. It doesn't make any sense to rescue a body when your life is in danger, but they did it anyway. But they were too slow, and they also got murdered. I want the world to know about October 7th, that good people have not died, but brutally I don't know how to pronounce that, even if it was in Hebrew, but I think it says it all.
It's just, I think what's so hard for me to understand is, I think unless you've actually experienced this and unless you know people who've been involved, the world has become so separated. I feel like a lot of people are just cold to violence, because I think on October 7th in the United States, there was the shock and there was the reaction, and people were obviously horrified seeing the videos coming in. But on October 8th, it was like another day. And then you started to hear the trickling of the propaganda and the not only the celebration of what happened on October 7th on city streets and college campuses, but the justification and the, well, yeah, but what about this thing Israel's done? Or what about that thing Israel's done? And I
Yeah.
know you spent a lot of time in the US, but also, in Europe and across the world. What's been your experience of that, of the pushback, of the denial, of honestly the hatred that Jews are seeing across the world simply for being massacred and then daring to fight back?
I find it actually funny that the people that are going against Israel, or as they call Zionists, they have no idea what they're supporting of. Up until like a few months ago, I had literally no idea what's going on around the world because I was busy with the battlefield.
Mm-hmm.
So as soon as I got to Columbia University and places like that, actually one time in Columbia University, and I've filmed that, I saw a 20-year-old woman. She had like a top as her shirt and short pants,
Mm-hmm.
and the kafia was covering her hips. I'll tell you what, Ian, if that girl will go in Ramallah dressed up like that, she will get, how do you call it? I don't know. They will kill her at the spot.
Mm-hmm.
She had no idea what she's supporting of. Um, there is a separation between Palestinians and Hamas. And as soon as you're trying to push back Israel, you're supporting terrorism. Because even if you see Gazans posting on their Instagram pages and stuff, these past days they're just saying that Hamas is making their life miserable and they want to get free. And if
Mm-hmm.
you want to free Palestinians, so called, from Hamas, then you just need to support Israel. That's my point of view. The pushback is enormous. I interviewed this one guy where I met you back in Nashville, Tennessee. His name is Tom. Tom told me, I don't think that they're necessarily pro-Hamas. It's just an excuse.
Mhm.
What they're really into is going against Israel.
And I think that's very true, because I think quite often when you ask people about, say, other so-called human rights abuses or other wars or cases where Palestinians, for example, are being killed in Syria, like, no one cares. Turkey just launched an attack on the Kurds. No one cares. There's like 1 million Uyghur Muslims in a concentration camp in China making, the phones people use, the shoes all of these protesters are wearing. No one cares. So I think the moment Israel is involved, it's just a return of the anti-Semitism that's unfortunately been everywhere for a very long time. But on the topic of, you were talking about like Palestinians in Gaza, and there is some level of opposition to Hamas. When you were in the IDF in Gaza, what was your experience with people who actually lived there? Because the image presented is always as the evil IDF going in, ethnic cleansing, genocide. They're there to murder civilians, which is just obviously not true. If you spend more than 3 seconds actually reading about it, learning about it, speaking to people in the IDF, you realize how absurdly untrue that is. But what was your experience of speaking with, dealing with, interacting with Palestinians when you were in Gaza?
Um, it's complicated. You see, you have no armed terrorists in Gaza that you can see.
Mm-hmm.
So as soon as you see a person, mostly a man, usually up between 15 to it goes up until 60-year-old, you have no idea whether it's a civilian or like undercover terrorist. So as soon as you see a person, you're trying to figure out if maybe they have a weapon underneath their cloak, because they're
Mm-hmm.
wearing cloaks. Um, Sometimes, as soon as you're trying to figure it out, and it's a matter of a second, they're pulling it out and shoot towards you on automatic. And just saying here that us, the IDF, I have never. I've been fighting for the past 11 years now, right? I have never in my entire life shot a single bullet on automatic, um, but by the bullet. It
Mm-hmm.
always
Yeah.
goes bam.
Semi-automatic.
Yeah, thank you. Because we have a saying that each bullet has an address. You have to be
Mm-hmm.
precise because you don't want to make damage even to property, not less people. Um, yeah, but I have always been shot at on automatic. So it's complicated when we're engaging with civilians and we can make sure that they're not terrorists. We're trying to help them. We actually have footage of us giving them food back in Netzarim hallway. I don't know how to
Mm-hmm.
pronounce that in English, but we're trying to get them to safety. We're trying to help them as much as we can. Sometimes you have terrorists that are hiding literally in the white flags groups that are going to safety, and you know it, and you have nothing to do about it. So it's complicated.
Mm-hmm. And what's been your experience? I know there's been a lot of focus on UNRWA, like the United Nations Refugee Agency that focuses on,
Right.
Palestinians. There's been a lot of news coming in for months of, terrorists who have embedded in those groups, or terrorists who have worked in schools associated with them, or people throwing on press outfits saying they're journalists when they're just members of Hamas. What's been your experience of that? Because I think whenever something like that happens, it's like gold for the propagandists, right? Every single time it's, look, Israel killed a journalist, Israel killed a UN worker, Israel killed a teacher. When, if you actually look into it, they're never a teacher, they're never an aid worker, they're never a journalist. It's just putting on a journalist t-shirt while you're trying to kill civilians doesn't make you a journalist. Have you come across any cases like that?
Yeah, basically, we have the Jewish holiday called Purim when you have when you're disguised, when you're pretending to be someone else. I think it's like Halloween in the States, when you put on a costume. The battlefield is an ongoing Purim, basically, because
Mm-hmm.
the terrorists can dress up however they want, and it could go out as a press person, a reporter, a journalist, sometimes a man dressed up as a woman, and like you can see anything in the battlefield. When you have UNRWA, um, basically sometimes supporting the actions of Hamas and, in one way or another, Iran's actions. It just makes me sad because when I went to the UN for a tour, like a couple of weeks ago, I've actually asked the instructor, the one who gave me the tour, I asked her, I'm sorry, you're speaking about UNRWA and their job to make peace possible. Um, how can you make sure that it's happening? Because up in the northern Israel border, you have UN facilities literally less than 100 meters, I'd say less than 300 foot from tunnels and base camps of Hezbollah. And she had never had a response to that. Yeah.
I think it's the lack of response, right? Because the problem with any kind of conflict, like this isn't new, right? People embedding in civilian entities is not new. It happened in World War II. It's been happening in conflicts all over. But I think what I struggle with is the naivety of it. Just the assumption that everyone is exactly who they say they are. Anyone dressed as a civilian. Like we're not dealing with people who are wearing uniforms here. Like we're dealing with people who use civilians. No. When you came to the US, did you find that there was that level of just naivety of just not understanding that people are willing to use their children as tools of terrorism? There are people who are willing to stand behind children as human shields. Did you find that a lot of people just don't understand that level of evil? Because I feel like whenever I speak to people on college campuses, that's a block. Everyone thinks the world is exactly like America, where everyone loves their children, everyone wants peace. No one is willing to do something as despicable as like using your child for terrorism. But there are people like that.
Tell you what, I think you are describing the biggest problems that Israel and basically the entire West is facing with, and that is that we're trying to see the enemy's actions throughout our own mindset. So if you and me, and I assume your listeners would, before we're doing an action, will say, this will be the damage or the potential damage, this will be the benefit. And then you're trying to make it worthy. Because you're focusing on yourself. When you have a terrorist, before they committing an action, they don't do this. They don't do the balance thing. They're just doing the how can I make them get hurt. Think about Shahid, like an explosive terrorist that's wearing a vest and exploding themselves in civilian areas. They know that they will pay with their lives, but they value our death more than they value their own children's lives. And that's when it gets tricky. About your question, I think that what I find challenging the most around the US and Europe, people don't get the terror narrative. They are mixing the Palestinian so-called narrative and the terror narrative into one, but it's just the other way around.
What factor do you think race plays? Because I think that's something, again, on college campuses, I don't think this is necessarily true worldwide. But I think in the United States, race has become such an important part of this on-campus debate, where they see Israelis, or really Jews, as white, and they see Palestinians as brown. Therefore, Jews are wrong, Palestinians are right. And I think there's a lot of people who dismiss, whenever I speak about the issue, as the go back to Poland crowd, right? Of just like, you're a colonizer, Jews are white, Jews are from Eastern Europe, what are you talking about? There's no level of indigenous Jewish population in Israel. It's kind of like the attitude that Palestinians have had, their leaders have had for decades of, there's no Jewish history, the temple wasn't there, it's all propaganda. Is the racial lens that's put on it just the fact like Jews are white?
Okay, yeah.
Is that something you've come across as well, or is it more about religion? Because I think in the United States, it's almost people are being anti-Semitic almost by accident. I think there's a lot of people who see it purely as white versus brown. Yeah. Therefore, the people who are white are bad.
Yeah, let's give it a second about that separation. My grandfather is a Holocaust survivor from Auschwitz. His wife, though, my grandmother, she was born in Israel, the state of Israel. I mean, the land of Israel. You can call it Palestine. By the way, does that make me Palestinian? I don't know. My father, though, he came from Morocco. He's pure brown. You see, when you're trying to see Israelis or Jews or Zionists, however we'll call them, as a single group, then you got it all wrong. We are mixed. I have Ethiopian friends and Morocco friends and Ashkenazi and Sfaradi. And, as when they're trying, back in, where was it? I think Long Island. I spoke in high school. And then later on, I spoke with this person outside, and he asked me, I'm brown skinned though, will they allow me into Israel? Then you realize that the narrative is all wrong, that they have literally no idea. 20% out of the population of Israel, nearly 2 million, are Arabs. It's so mixed. The society is so mixed. You have no pure white. You have no pure black. That doesn't go this way.
I think that's what people don't understand about Israel generally, is that people, especially like the politically leftist people here, the people who are protesting on college campuses, if Israel wasn't Jewish, I feel like they would love Israel, right? It's so diverse. It's
democracy in the Middle East.
There's almost too much democracy, right? You have an election every 5 minutes. You can't agree on anything. It's constantly chaotic. You have people constantly protesting. No one likes the government, regardless of who the government is. Right? You have gay pride parades every single year.
Right.
Everything that the left here wants America to be, I feel like Israel is. And yet you've got this hatred of Israel and then an embrace of all the countries around them that hate gay people, that hate women's rights, that hate transgender people, that hate opportunity and education and all of these things. It is so backwards. And I think that's what's, again, so hard when you're speaking with these people, because it's like, oh, as a brown person, am I safe? It's like, they still have black slaves in many Arab countries, right? Like there's a ongoing problem of slavery in the Middle East, and it is not in Israel. There's just such a level of ignorance that is really hard to break through.
Definitely. You're reminding me of something very interesting. When I spoke with the leader of the raid back in May 2024, the women who led the raid and took control of the Colombia facilities. I spoke with her, forgot her name though, spoke with her and one of her colleagues. And they told me, and I have that on camera, that you have an apartheid in Israel because Arabs do not have the right to go wherever they want, work in whatever job they want, or vote. Immediately, I never said a word. I just took out my phone and I showed him the 10 Arab members in our parliament. I showed them the judge in our Supreme Court, Arab judge, of course. I showed them that Jews are not allowed to go certain places in Judea and Samaria, even though, it's part of like Jews and Judea, but Arabs are allowed to go wherever they want. And they told me about the checkpoints. So I asked them, I'm sorry, between certain states, countries, different areas, don't you have that in Europe or the States as well? I mean, you wanna like keep track or on whoever, what's going on. Besides that, you literally have terrorists that are trying to get into Israel and commit terror attacks. Take for example, just a couple of 3 weeks ago, in Tuesday, you have in Jaffa near Tel Aviv 2 terrorists that murdered some 8 people, including one of my friends, Shachar. So if this doesn't justify only the minute that you have to spare, I don't know what is.
But again, I think it's the naivety, right? Of people in America are very safe, right? I every time I go on campus, I say, we thank goodness we're safe, right? Because people in the military and people in law enforcement, and the fact that the United States is thousands of miles away from any enemy, that you don't have to live in constant fear. You don't have to live in fear of what your neighbor might do to you. But look how people would change the second something happened, right? It's kind of, this is a different analogy, but it's the way a lot of politicians in America talk about the riots during the BLM riots in 2020, for example. You had riots across the country, stores being burned down, people looting stores, people being assaulted, and a lot of politicians didn't care. It was all about an expression against racism. And then the second they were under threat, when rioters were in DC, all the walls started popping up, all the barbed wire fences came up, all the police flooded in. I think there's a lot of people who only see a problem with violence when it impacts them.
Yeah.
And so they see the border control in Israel and they see the barbed wire fences and they see the checkpoints. And all they do is say checkpoint bad because they're projecting themselves on the people who are being stopped at the checkpoint. They're not seeing the people who are being stopped, many of whom are good people, many of whom are not. Right? If you lived next to a constant threat of terrorism, you're going to want a border check. Because if you just read, I don't have to tell you, but I'm telling like the audience, if you just read basic Israeli history of the last 100 years or so, there's a constant threat of terrorism. And the only way you can prevent that is either by directly fighting terrorists, which people hate it when Israel does, or by controlling a border, which also people hate it when Israel does. So it's a constant lose-lose. It's like it must make your head spin sometimes.
Yeah, definitely. I have nothing to add on that. You said the precise feelings that I'm feeling. Yeah.
So I want to go back to, I think, two things. I want to talk about Colombia in a little bit. I want to focus a bit more on your experience fighting up to October 7th, because some of the speeches you gave, I had the pleasure of coming to hear you speak, and some other IDF reservists hearing you speak about your experience. One thing, I'm going to put the image up on the screen for everyone to see, but I think one image that was really stunning was side by side of you and your father fighting in the Yom Kippur War and you fighting now. What does that mean to you in terms of not just you fighting, but having a generational fight that I'm sure you and all the people around you also have? Like, fighting the IDF is so common in some way. What does that do to you as a community and a society? Because I think in the United States, in the West generally, there are plenty of people who serve in the military, but very few people, if you don't know someone who fought in the military, it's like a completely foreign thing. It's like a movie. It's not real. I would love to get your insight on just how raw it feels to have someone, your father fighting and then you fighting essentially in the same war.
Same war, same enemies, 50 years apart. I think that's a story of a nation. You have in the picture just me and my dad, but that's the story of the Jewish nation. I am the youngest out of 5 siblings, and my father is nearly 70. Think about it, of how we're living in a constant threat. By the way, both of the wars started because of Israel's just trying to mind its own business and live in peace in the land that we got from the UN. And you have other people that thinks differently, that we're not entitled to not just live in Israel, but live in general. That's basically it.
I think it's the living in general part that is always... It's always a struggle, right? Because you're talking about with people who are anti-Israel in some way, and they talk about Israel. They're committing genocide. No, they're not. They're committing ethnic cleansing. No, they're not. But then they talk about like the colonial aspect, which I always think is so funny, because if you look at a picture of the Arab world, you have to zoom in so far to even find Israel, right? It's like 650 times larger, I think, the Muslim world than Israel. Like, Israel is the size of New Jersey, and the Muslim world is like 5.6 million square miles or something. Mm-hmm. Again, it's like the world is upside down. When people talk about Israel, it's a colonial entity. It is the tiniest piece of land in a vast swathe of multiple continents that is either a Muslim country, like full-on Islam as a state religion, or it's Muslim majority. Right. People just don't see it that way. And have you had any success on college campuses breaking through with these people? Or is it just they're so shocked when you push back that they don't know what to do with it?
They were in shock, definitely. But I think that one thing that actually came across and they're accepted is that when you're trying to give your thoughts about certain situations, especially if it's complicated, you need to see the whole picture. Mm-hmm. So they told me that Gaza is the biggest air prison in the world, and Israel is completely controlling it. Mm-hmm. And then they were surprised to figure it out that actually Egypt has a border with Gaza, that Israel has nothing to do with it up until the war. By the way, that's the main oxygen tunnel or route of Hamas to get their weapons from. But I asked them, when you have a border with a terror organization or a terror regime, wouldn't you try to be like in charge, or to see what's going on and control that border that you have literally few 100 meters away your own civilians? Wouldn't you want to know what's going on? Wouldn't you want to like make sure that the terror regime doesn't take any weapons into it? And I think that was the point when they accepted it, because they never knew that Egypt has a border with Gaza. They never knew that most of Judea and Samaria back in the days were in Jordan, and that Jordan gave up back in the 80s on their rights of Judea and Samaria, meaning that it's not theirs anymore. So who it belongs to, I don't know, maybe to the people who lived there for 3,000 years or so. Yeah.
I think no one knows anything about geography, right? I think this is a problem beyond Israel. But it's like when you hear people chanting from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, and you ask them which river and which sea, they're like, oh, I don't know. So, well, that's kind of important if we're talking about borders. They can't tell you where Israel is. They can't tell you about Israel's borders or Israel's neighbors. They can't tell you when the modern state of Israel was founded. There's such a level of ignorance, but then there's so much confidence in what they think about Israel. Like, it's one thing to be ignorant and not really care, but it's another thing to be ignorant and care so deeply and believe so deeply that Israel is just the modern day Nazi Germany.
Yes.
It's unbelievable.
You know, they have this theory. I'm sorry, I forgot the name of it, but as soon as you know a little bit, your confidence goes way up, way high. And then as soon as you're learning just a little bit more, your confidence drops, and you realize that you don't know anything. And then it goes into like more balanced ration between what you know and how you're feeling comfortable with it. I do want to say something that I forgot earlier about the narrative. I think that regarding to what you said, they are embracing the victim narrative of the poor Palestinians living under an apartheid or whatnot, and they're literally living any sense. They're just taking the victim narrative with all their heart. I'll tell you what, Maria Salah is a Lebanese journalist who said on live air, I today hereby declare that I as a mother wish that God will take my children and bring him, Hassan Nasrallah, back. Now, Hassan Nasrallah is one of the major terrorists that were in this war, he caused so much damage, so many casualties, both Arabs and Jews alike. And as soon as you realize that the narrative is supporting terrorism, as if there were, some free fighters, then you realize that the reason that they're supporting in Columbia University of that narrative is it basically have two reasons. First of all, they don't understand what they're supporting of. Two, it became a fashion. If a girl is wearing kafia around her hips and think it's cool, she has to go to Ramallah and realize that she will pay with her life.
Yeah. Well, it's like the gays for Gaza and all that stuff. It's insane.
Chicken for KFC.
Yes, exactly. It makes no sense, but I don't think these people. There are some people on college campuses who I think are genuinely evil, who I think genuinely despise Jews and genuinely want to destroy Jews. But I think the vast majority of these people, I think they're good people. They've just been wildly misled. I think they've been convinced of this propaganda, and I think you're right. They see everything through this victim mentality, and so they do see Hamas as so-called freedom fighters in a justified war. And they haven't bothered to look into the over 100 years of really jihadi radical Islam that has imparted this view that you should sacrifice your children for the greater good.
Even in Piers Morgan's show, you have the Egyptian activist, I forgot her name. She said, of course you'll have October 7th if you're occupied land. What do you mean? There is no justification for terrorism. And I'm gladly inviting her to debate me or any of her likes. I do have one condition, though. Let's do a polygraph machine, because I'm convinced that they know that they're lying. And I'm willing to be asked on hard questions about 2014, the war in Gaza, the current war in Gaza, which I also thought, just do your thing, ask me anything. That's my only condition, because
Well,
the
also,
truth has to go out.
especially when you dig into radical Islam and the jihadi mentality. And I
Yeah,
say radical Islam because I think it's really important to make a distinction between Muslims and radical Muslims. But
definitely.
if you actually read their writings, they
Yeah.
openly say it's fine to make agreements or to say what you think or to lie with infidels to get what you want. If you look
Hmm.
at the history of agreements made between, say, like Yasser Arafat and the PLO in Israel, or deals Hamas and like Hezbollah have made, they don't care. They're not going to follow these things. So all these people who are demanding a ceasefire only works when you have a shared set of values and you're both agreeing to something. But when one side will just smile, they'll sign anything, they'll take the money, and then they'll use that money to go and plan another October 7th. No one in their right mind would accept that. No American would accept that. If, say, Mexico was sending over terrorists every single day, and it's like, okay, well, we're going to sign an agreement with them. I know last time they broke the agreement, the time before that they broke the agreement, the time before that, but maybe this time. It's maddening. There's such a level of ignorance that I feel like all the truth is there and it's just so obvious. You just can't get through to some people. And I do think you're right. I think some of them are knowingly lying because it's all part of the routine. They know the truth. I think there's ignorant people out there who are being swept up in it. But I think the loudest voices, just like terrorist leaders themselves, they know exactly what they're doing.
I'm just curious, what their motive is. I'll
Mm-hmm.
tell you mine. It's just to live, it's just to survive. It's just that I'm soon to marry my fiance. I want to have my children not to be able to do the same picture that I did with my dad 50
Mm-hmm.
years into the future. By the way, that's why I'm doing this. When I go to reserves, I don't want to go to reserves. I mean, I want to live my life.
Yeah.
I want to take my girlfriend to restaurant and pet my dog and sleep in my home and be with my family. I think their motive is either ignorance, or they're just lost souls
Mm-hmm.
who's looking for purpose in life, or the leaders of them, maybe they're getting paid by
Mm-hmm.
the head of the Octopus Iran and its proxies. I don't know. I assume that's gotta be it.
I think a lot of it comes down to power as well, because I
Oh,
think,
definitely.
like for example, Al Husseini, who's like one of the founding fathers of the Palestinian movement,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
everyone can be tied to him. If you look at the power struggle of like Palestinians prior to the founding of Israel in the 20s and the 30s, there were some moderates, there were some people who wanted to accept two-state solution. There was a significant power struggle here. And I think in much the same way as Nazi Germany used like anti-Semitism as the driving wedge for people, I think radical Islam uses anti-Semitism in exactly the same way. And they
Hmm.
use Israel as a way, it's like, well, yeah, we disagree on this, this, and this, but we all hate the Jews. And so I think it all comes down to power of just, it doesn't matter how much Iran, and Lebanon and Syria and all these countries don't get along. They can all come together and they can all hate Jews. And Israel becomes just this, it's just the Jewish country. And so it has exactly the same treatment. And so I do
Right.
think there are liars. I do think there are people being paid. But I think hatred is a very powerful motivator. We see it in
Definitely.
politics across the world. And I think just anti-Semitism is the world's longest hate, and I think deepest hate in many ways. It's just the ultimate tool of power. It works in Germany, and I think it's working in the Middle East, and it's going to keep working, I think, until people break that mindset. How we break that mindset is a really hard question, but I think power is, there are some people who just seek it, and they will do anything for it.
I did had talks, which I felt that you have no partner to talk with,
Mm-hmm.
and then I realized that I told myself one time, I was like, damn, it's way harder to convince someone rather to brainwash him,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
Um, and you don't even need to go that far with their ideology. You only need to go to Tehran in Iran. They have in their how do you call, I'm sorry, like in their crossroads, one of the biggest crossroads in Tehran,
Mm-hmm.
they have a huge sign, their charter, that says death to Israel, death to America.
It's not subtle. They're pretty open about it. it's, like,
Yeah,
it's like there's a lot of people who can see
I'll
that.
give
Oh,
them
I'm sure
that.
they
They're
don't
being
mean it.
honest. Yeah,
It's also so strange because I think people move on from things too quickly now as well, because,
Right.
9/11 in the United States was over 20 years ago. And I think in the immediate aftermath of that, I think people understood terrorism. I think they
Hmm.
understood the brutality, the ruthlessness, the bloodthirsty worship of death over life, which is exactly what Hamas leaders have said. They've said, like, we worship death like the Jews worship life. They're very open about it.
Right.
And I think so much time has gone by that I think now we have a new generation. And I want to dig into your experience, especially on Columbia, but just on college campuses generally, if we have a younger generation who weren't even alive during 9/11. And so in the United States, you don't have this memory of terrorism. You have images of terrorism across the world, or maybe you'll get a report every now and again, of a shooting or a stabbing or something. But you don't have that image seared into your mind of October 7th, because I think October 7th and 9/11, in terms of the impact on the country, is very similar.
Hmm.
But for people of my generation and older who remember seeing planes fly into Twin Towers and seeing people falling to their deaths, throwing themselves from the windows to escape the fire, people being crushed as the building collapsed, just
Right.
the anguish and the phone calls of people on the planes knowing they were going to their deaths. We don't have that memory anymore. We don't have that burned into our psyche, the younger generation, I mean.
Yeah.
And so now they see something like October 7th, and it's like seeing a movie. They don't see themselves in those people when they really should. And so, did you experience that when you were on college campuses and you were speaking with people? Did you just see this divide where people don't understand evil? Like they
Yeah.
don't understand violence?
Definitely. We have this saying in Hebrew. It goes "Rachok me'ayin, rachok me'alev." If it fars from your eye, it fars from your heart. You know, if you can't see it, you can't feel anything about it. Um, yeah, I could see that the younger generation, mostly the younger generation, I'd say 20-year-old, and some of them were 18. They literally have a lack of knowledge with 9/11 even. But they truly do not understand that you have a person that wants to kill you, regardless of who you are, just because, I mean, regardless of your personality, just
Mm-hmm.
because you are a Jew, for instance, or an American back in 9/11. I think that if they'll figure it out, that you have pure hate and evil versus darkness sometimes, maybe things will change. But they think that they are the light. That's the
Mm-hmm.
problem.
Was there anything that surprised you when you went to these college campuses in a good way? I know often whenever we talk about these issues, it always goes down the negative because it is a negative topic, right? We're talking about hate, we're talking about violence, we're talking about terrorism. But I always find it interesting to kind of try and flip the script a little bit. Did you ever have good experiences? Was there ever anything that surprised you, like people who reached out to you or anyone you met that you remember as feeling like, okay, this actually gives me hope. Like this isn't a losing cause.
Hmm. Um, I want to be optimistic. I do remember an Israeli came to me at the end of the lecture, speaking in Hebrew, and I was in total shock, because who would
Mm-hmm.
imagine? And he was like, "Listen, I'm an Israeli. Nobody knows. I moved here because my parents were afraid to live in Israel after October 7th, and now I'm afraid. They're afraid that I'll speak in Hebrew here again. So, thank you for coming here and make our voice being heard and telling the whole picture, the black, the white, and all the spectrum between
Mm-hmm.
it." Um, it really moved me. I don't know if it's optimistic point of view, but
Mm-hmm.
I figured that, in a certain way, I could see the family of my grandfather in Czechoslovakia 80 years back, um, need to flee, need to run for their lives, even though they got caught anyway and been sent to Auschwitz. But I don't know. It's just I figured that us Jews, even though we think that we're done running away, that's not the situation quite
Mm-hmm.
yet. Israelis are actually Jews are literally running away from Israel because they're feel that their life is in danger.
I think that's what's so doing what I do when I try and speak with people. I try and speak with Americans. Whenever I speak to Jews in America, there's always this almost a reflex of either it won't get that bad, which Jews have been saying for centuries, and it usually gets pretty bad. I don't think that's a good way to view things. But
Yeah.
there's always a view of Israel as being like the backup plan. Like, well, if things get really bad, I'll just go to Israel. And that's where I try and push back, because I think if you want to go and live in Israel for a positive reason, I think that's wonderful. I
Right.
don't think Israel should be a backup plan,
Interesting.
because the moment there isn't a backup plan, where do you go? Right. I think Jews need to have this attitude that I think Israeli Jews exemplify. They have to have this attitude of, I deserve to be where I am right now. I deserve to be standing on my own 2 feet where I am right now as
Mhm.
a citizen of wherever I am, whether
Right.
it be the United States, Great Britain, France, Germany. But I think there are a lot of Jews who are still uncomfortable with that. They're still uncomfortable to speak firmly and, no matter the consequences, say, I deserve to be here. Right? It's the people who hide their yarmulke or hide their Star of David. I understand that when there's physical threat, but I think there's a lot of people who aren't willing to take that little step. They aren't willing to proudly be Jewish and proudly speak, doing what you're doing, right? You're putting yourself out there, you're traveling the world, becoming a face of an issue. And I think there's more Jews who need to be doing what you're doing, not necessarily to the same extent. They don't need to be traveling, but it's just being proud to say, I'm Jewish, being proud to push back when you hear an abject lie. I think that's something that needs to change, so that like the Israeli you spoke with doesn't feel so shocked when they hear someone saying obvious truths, right? We live in a world that celebrates pride in whatever minority you are. I don't think Jews have that. And I think Jews need to build that for themselves.
I agree. I think that big changes lies in small steps, and if any of these of the Jews around the world will not hide their Star of David and actually support whatever they can feel comfortable with associating with Israel, then we'll have a change. Because we're definitely the minority. I mean, how many Jews you have in the world, like versus the Jews haters.
Mm-hmm. It's a lot. I
We
mean,
need,
there's 16 million Jews in the world. We're up against pretty bad odds.
well, if we learn anything about the history of the IDF, is that we can manage
Yeah, that's for
even when
sure.
the odds are against us. The reason that we're managing to defeating them even when the odds are against us is not mine, but the Golda Meir's saying, former Prime Minister of Israel, the only women Prime Minister of Israel, is one of our best. She said, us Jews, we have a secret weapon against the Arabs. We have no other place to go.
Yeah.
Unlike them, they have dozens of other countries.
I think it's always something people don't understand as well, is that Israel is truly fighting to exist.
Yeah,
It's not just a fight for territory. Like a lot of other wars in human history have always been fighting over territory, but it's rarely been a case of elimination.
right.
Whereas the Holocaust was clearly an example of elimination, and that spread into the Middle East. There's been ethnic cleansing and massacres for a long time, but the idea of complete eradication of a people, that's what Jews are facing. I think that's when people talk about, you got to have a proportional response of, you got to come to the table. Yes, they have hostages, but isn't it more important to get peace? All of these attitudes do not understand the fundamental fact that Israel is fighting against eradication. They're not fighting against some kind of political argument or political battle. It's literally fighting for the right to exist. And I think if people understood that, they would understand everything else.
Yeah, I think they're denying it. I think that they see Israel as the attacker, not as the defender. But that's a problem. Yeah, tell you what, in October 7th, I've lost 4 friends in the Nova Festival, 4 other friends who fell in battle. One of them is Tomer Achimas, and was a 19-year-old. He got killed, and his body being captured into Gaza's tunnels for 54 days. No one knew what happened to him. We actually hoped that he survived the attack. That's only when we learned that he actually died back in October 7th, and now you know that your son, your friend, your brother is dead, but his body is being held in the tunnels of Gaza, of Hamas. What would you do?
Mm-hmm.
Basically, we buried some sand tainted with his blood, and a few months later, his father's wish came true. He wished, just let me bury my son. One of the most heartbreaking wishes that a father can have. their IDF rescued his body, and there you have it, a 20-year-old with 2 funerals. We are fighting for our own existence. When you have massive Iranian attacks, 180 was it, ballistic missiles shooting all around Israel. That's 10 million people, and 10 million Jews, Arabs, Muslims, Christians, whoever. We all had to seek shelter, regardless of who you are. We are fighting for our own very existence. And I think that's a great date that you chose to do this talk, because you have the Israel response targeting Iranians' military targets, and that's the whole story right there.
Yeah. I think what's so strange as well is whenever we talk about the response or what happened after October 7th, I hear this a lot where it's like, well, yeah, Israel has all these tanks. Israel has all these bomb shelters. Israel has the Iron Dome. And the Palestinians don't have any of that.
Why?
So it's an unfair fight.
Why don't they have shelters?
Yes. It's like, why do Hamas have shelters? Again, it's everything. The thing I always say is Israel is held to an impossible standard and Hamas are held to no standard at all. Because if you can blame Israel for the deaths of all these civilians, but hold Hamas to absolutely no account whatsoever,
yeah,
how can you ever win that propaganda battle? If that's how people see it, that there's nothing Israel can do right and there's nothing Hamas can do wrong, you've lost, right? There's no bringing that person back.
You could never. I asked the activists, the so-called pro-Palestinians activists, they're not pro-Palestinians. If they were, they would support Israel, because we're trying to eliminate Hamas, the enemy of the Palestinians as well. But I asked them, tell me, back in 2005, when Israel left Gaza, why did Hamas build down instead of up? Why did they build tunnels instead of a state, a country, buildings? I don't know. Why don't the Palestinians have shelters wherever they are? Well, simply because their leaders are taking that money for terrorism.
Yeah. And shamelessly.
And I'm sorry, just saying that they don't need shelters because Israel does not fire over civilians. That's not what we do. We're targeting major terrorists, and if they're hiding among civilians, which is of course a war crime, then you have no other choice but to eliminate the threat.
Yep. Well, again, because people don't understand what those terrorists want to do, right? When you, for example, like the rocket fire issue, right? People don't seem to care that Hamas and Islamic Jihad and all these groups are firing rockets every single day. Like, yes, the Iron Dome takes a lot of them down, but does that negate the fact that they're firing rockets to try and kill civilians? It's like, oh, someone shot at me, but I have a bulletproof vest, so, what's the big deal? It's so bizarre.
It is. The pro-Palestinians, they're judging actions based on the results, but I'm judging it based on the cause, on the threat, of the potential damage that could have happened to me unless I wouldn't have the Iron Dome. And I think that is what matters. What is the intention? What they truly want to achieve? So back in October 7th, they could never eliminate Israel. Obviously, a few thousand terrorists cannot overcome the IDF. They can create a huge damage, and 1,200 of our best people got murdered. Of course, I'm talking about women who I know, women who got raped, babies who've been burned, people who got brutally, seriously tortured and killed. By the way, I know a guy who got murdered by the thieves of the third wave of the Gazans going to Israel. I mean, if you're come to steal, why do you have to murder as well? So if we'll judge actions based on their cause, based on what they're trying to get, of the potential damage, then you'll see a series of war crimes that you must to put an end to it.
If you want to hear the last couple of questions, please head over to my Substack and subscribe. You can help support the podcast and help support the work I'm doing, and also hear more about what Stav has to say.